I bought it for you. And I come in. Some water, please.
Sanbonani Nonke, a very good afternoon to all our viewers. I trust you are all well and safely at home. My name is Naidoo. I represent the 1860 Heritage Center as your host for this online in-conversation event with former student leaders and activists who participated in the 1980 student boycotts. Indeed, this is an important period of our collective South African history to be reflecting on, given the many problems that we are faced with in contemporary South Africa. I would like to acknowledge all our panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for sacrificing your family time to be with us this afternoon. I would like to also acknowledge our chairperson for this session, a proud former Tongaat resident, Siva Naidoo. Before I hand over to Siva Naidoo, I would like to ask Satish Tupelia, a director of the 1860 Heritage Center, to welcome you. I trust that you enjoy this in-conversation event. I thank you. Satish, over to you.
My greetings to everybody on this fine afternoon. And on behalf of the board of the 1860 Heritage Center, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for not just being on the panel today, but also for your contributions in the past. I think it's very important that we have you here to share those moments and to share that history. I'd also like to thank all those people who have logged on the different digital platforms for making the time to participate today and learn about the interesting period in history. In particular, I want to say thank you to Selva Naidoo, who's been driving our online activities. If anybody could find a positive about COVID-19, it has been that the 1860 Heritage Center board, and it has been allowed to expand its digital footprint, not just to different parts of South Africa, but also to other countries. And we have to thank Selvan again for driving this initiative. The 1860 Heritage Center tells the story of the indentured, but it also focuses on subsequent generations and how they embrace South African citizenship and their contribution in the different fields. And of course, the battle for liberation is a very important one, where they work together with different race groups and democratic forces, often at great personal risk. And that is what today's talk is all about. And so I'd like to say again, thank you to all our panelists, and I'm looking forward to this exciting and interesting talk. Thank you, Siva.
Thank you, Satish, for those introductory remarks. It's always a pleasure having the 1860 Heritage Center hosting these virtual sessions. I'm your facilitator for this afternoon Zoom session, and the topic that we are talking to this afternoon is the 1918 Schools Boycott. I'm going to give you some introductory remarks, which will perhaps set the base for our session. The session is going to be conducted in 3 parts: session 1, session 2, and session 3. And in each of these sessions, we have 3 panelists. And each of the panelists would have 5 minutes each to do their presentations. And thereafter, we will have a discussion for about 15 to 20 minutes of each session. And we have commentators who would be contributing towards the discussion in each of the sessions. But for an introduction, the 1980 Schools Boycott, essentially in 1960, the National Party declared a state of emergency, outlawing the African National Congress and other political formations. The period following the emergency had the effect of subduing progressive political activism for at least 5 years. During this period, the emergence of the Black consciousness movement took over, and the youth in particular were charged with a militancy that we had not known before. Young people in schools and in universities were heavily influenced by this militancy. They refused to be defined by their parents. In the decade of the 1980s, the 1980 Schools Boycott set the tone for countrywide mass community and political mobilization. Credit must go to the learners of the Western Cape, who were, in my view, the catalyst for the mass protest that swept the length and breadth of this country, which later coalesced into a powerful movement for change in our country. The accompanying activism, dedication, and commitment by young people paved the way to free the country from the yoke of apartheid. Post the student uprising in 1976, apartheid was never well again. It was a year in 1980 that saw school-going urban youth desperate to make something of their lives, but concerned that their future was worse than their parents present, lashed out against the system, destroying it where they could, boycotting schools and public transport, refusing to allow their parents to pay escalating rental on council housing, and attacking black township councillors and policemen. 1980 saw organized resistance, the rise of the civic movement, workers, youth, and women's organizations. Whilst 1976 was primarily a visceral response to apartheid, particularly the imposition of Afrikaans, etc., the 1980s represented an organized, multi-sectoral, multi-pronged onslaught against apartheid. 1980 also saw an increase in hundreds of students being recruited into the underground activities of the African National Congress. The ANC in exile, through its work on the international Pillay, secured a resolution from the United Nations Security Council and which tightened the noose around apartheid via this via the arms embargo and sanctions. The government had already succeeded in enacting and implementing a whole host of segregation laws to reinforce white privilege and control over the black majority. Black students were prohibited from attending white universities except by special permission in disciplines not available at black campuses. The Group Areas Act relegated national designated groups into separate residential areas. Likewise, all facilities were racially separated. The kids of today find it hard to believe we had separate worlds. We know that separate but equal, that claim was nothing but a myth. Students were having none of it. Whilst the call or demand was for free and compulsory education, students were demanding equal rights for all. The clarion call of the demands made in the Freedom Charter soon became the mantra of protesting students. By the mid-80s, the conflict between apartheid and anti-apartheid opposition intensified as never before. As the state repression intensified, the progressive resistance hardened and lost their traditional fear of the system. There was a sustained and organized defiance of racist laws similar to that of the 1950s before the onslaught of repressive legislation. Security laws were flouted with unusual contempt. Organizations and persons under restrictive orders flagrantly unrestricted themselves. There were mass occupations of beaches and black patients charged on government hospitals reserved for whites, demanding to be treated. The extent to which government had weakened was demonstrated when the 1989 racial tricam elections, doomed to be the last of its kind, were confronted with an 80% stay away from work. The tension between apartheid and progressives coincided with that of labor and capital, and it reached its breaking point. By 1989, it was clear that neither the government nor power through sheer repression, nor could the anti-apartheid forces deliver freedom to the people through sheer mass mobilization. The stalemate could have concluded indefinitely. State brutality on the one hand and mass martyrdom and sheer anarchy on the other. But for the intervention of the international banking interests, which, seeing that their investments were at risk, called in their loans. For the first time in South African history, business and humanitarian concerns coincided, thereby exploding the apartheid structure which had long been under stress. The joint struggles of students, their parents, and the workers, amongst other groups in society, gained steady momentum. Coupled with the military struggle, which was part of the wider strategic approach anchored in what the ANC called the four pillars of struggle: the armed struggle, internal mass mobilization, the international campaign to isolate the apartheid regime, and underground activities, the National Party had no choice but to negotiate a political settlement. Let's talk to the people that played key and critical roles to get their recollections and insight during this historic period of 1980. Our first speaker this afternoon hails from the Western Cape, but now residing in Pretoria, Gauteng. He was a young 16-year-old at that time. Logan Wort was a student and leader during the 1980 school boycotts in the Western Cape. He was a community activist in Mitchell's Plain and is the former vice president of the Cape Youth Congress, CACO, and a founder member of the South African Youth Congress. Logan Wort is the chief executive of the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, a multilateral organization for African revenue authorities. Let's welcome Logan, the first student leader to lead the Western Cape and the rest of the country in the student boycott. Welcome, Logan.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Comrade Shiva, and thank you to the 1816 Heritage Center for the invitation. I must say that, as you correctly point out, I was very young. I was one of many participants in the boycott in 1980 at the time. At the time of the boycott, I was not a leader in the Western Cape. I was only 16 years old. There were leaders there that led the process with us and for us. And chief amongst this were the people in the Committee of 81 who coordinated this boycott. I want to briefly share in two parts. One, the story of Hanover Park, where it all started and spread throughout the country from there. And two, very briefly look at the reflections and how it ended. So I will start by saying what started out on that warm February morning with me walking out of the classroom. I was incredibly scared. We decided that we're going to boycott. I was the leader of the school at the time. Like I said, localized at the school. I wasn't in politics at the time or anywhere in the Western Cape in any form. And I walked out, and it was probably about 30, 40 seconds later when other people followed, but it felt like hours because I wasn't sure whether people were going to come, because we decided we're going to boycott on this day. I can't remember the date, but it was in February. The boycott spread by April nationally, but we started in February. And when I walked out, because I was supposed to be the one to walk out first, I did. And a lot of things went through your mind. You've never done this before. And you don't know if you could trust people and believe what was going to happen. So we did. We walked out on the open field, and what seemed like hours, I looked behind me and I saw masses of learners, what they call learners today. We said students then, walking out and gathering on the field. And that was the beginning of things that I could not and we could not comprehend Hanover Park is a township on the Cape Flats, and nothing much outside of religion, sport, and gangsterism at the time happened there. So what started out like that had a history a few months before. In 1979, towards the last part of 1979, a group of us in Hanover Park were introduced to the YCW and YCS, Young Christian Workers, Young Christian Students. I'm sure many people know. And we just joined and were introduced to the See, Judge, and Act method, looking at genuine representation, all sorts of things. Very impressionable young kids from Mount View High School and Crystal High School in Hanover Park. And lo and behold, when we went back to school the following year in January, we started looking at our situation at school, things we thought were normal. By February, we still did not have books, not a single window in the school, broken toilets, drunk teachers. Those were the things that we were used to. And we started to realize that we deserved more than this. And that is all it started out as. And so we started to question this, and we were called to study weekends, what is called workshops later. And that is when I met my good friend on the panel here, Shepherd Marty, around 1980. And also at the time, our school was joined by two. It is significant that I mentioned this. The school then also employed two young white teachers, Brenda Libovich and Elizabeth Everett. And they were different to the teachers we were used to. They spent time with the kids during intervals. They introduced us to alternative form of music. And all of this created an atmosphere of questioning of what is going on around us at school. And there were meetings at the two high schools and in the YCW and in the YCS. A culmination of all of this was that we decided to call a meeting of parents, or what is later known as a public meeting at the local church, Anglican church. And that is when things then happened that we did not contemplate. It's not what we planned, but it was great. Firstly, we arrived at our own meeting and were greeted with Azaso pamphlets, a Zanian student organization. At that point, very few of us knew what a Zania was. And there was people like Ibrahim Patel, Jonathan de Vries, and others with long coats and long beards, university students dishing out pamphlets, and basically took over our meeting. And at the time, they then came and explained that our problem of toilets and windows and teachers is a broader problem of the apartheid education system and the apartheid system. And the whole meeting went on to begin to explain apartheid and the system to my generation of kids. I remember asking my friend sitting next to me that this guy has been speaking about the system the whole night. Who is that? I did not know what the system was. And so for us, that was the beginning. At the meeting, we developed a list of demands to the then Department of Colored Affairs, and also decided to call on a boycott until our demands was met. And this was the beginning of big things that went beyond our experience, including the call for SRC's representation and democracy. So when we returned to the school the next day, we were met with great hostility. The principal at Crystal High was part of the Colored Representative Council, the collaboration structures of the apartheid regime. And we were met with threats of expulsion and all sorts of things, but we continued to meet and we prepared the date for the walkout. So we did this in February 1980. And the long and short of this, from a basic set of conditions and without any much of a political conviction, we started this thing. And so we got involved in the 1980 boycott. But the leaders really came from the university and the progressive teachers of the Western Cape. And they were the ones who formed the Committee of 81. And the Committee of 81 largely consisted of students of 81 schools from in the Western Cape, Indian, colored, and African areas. People like Ibrahim Patel, Cecil Iso, Zanaria Barnes, Junaid Dasi, and Kent and Pule from Fezeka and Sizamile High were the key drivers around the Committee of 81. Importantly, around this time, the job was to conscientize schools, get people out to boycott, move for the establishment of SRCs. And so these leaders moved from school to school. We organized through political education programs and various forms of protest in the streets around our demand. Very significantly at the time was the simultaneous boycotts going on elsewhere in the trade unions. Fatties and Moni strike, the bus boycott, later the meat boycott. And the trade union leaders such as Johnny Issel, Virginia Engel, Oscar Mpeta, and others who were involved in this. So as young kids, we were thrown into a resistance momentum that we learned was part of a history of 1976, a history of 1977, of 1973, of the Steve Biko Black Consciousness era, and we were brought into this. It was all very scary, all very exciting, all very foreign, but really, really great to be involved in. Maybe then just to say that the boycott spread in April, between April and June, nationally, what was then Transvaal, KZN, Natal, Eastern Cape, and so on. For us, it escalated with the death of 2 young people, Bernard Fortuin of 15 and William Libber of 19. And then, of course, by July, it was all over for us. And that is the significance of the controversy of the ending of this boycott. Because in the Committee of 81 and amongst there was a debate about whether the decision to boycott was a matter of principle till our demands are met, or whether it was a tactic in order to engage in the broader struggle agenda. Be that as it may, we went back, but the African schools, the schools in Gugulethu and Langa did not go back. The schools in the rest of the country did not go back. And a huge debate ensued that had significant implications, amongst others, about 1, the Western Cape, and 2, where the coloureds can't stand the course because they were the ones who went back, and all sorts of other things which the panels can engage with. But that for me was a very significant break. Lastly, maybe to say that we went back in the Western Cape, we did not go back nationally. The significance of all of this for a young person like me and my generation was that for the first time we took control of schools. Schools were looked at as a site of struggle. It was a rebirth of the post-1976 generation of young leaders, and also, as you said, the emergence of community struggles, the call from mobilization to organization, the post-1980 civics, youth unions, and for us of little known Hanover Park, it was the beginning of big political things. Thank you.
Thank you, Logan. We're going to move on because it's quite a tight program. I want to make some comments, but I'm going to reserve that for later. Let's hear Sheppie Marty, your colleague, Logan. Sheppie Marty currently teaches radio journalism at Rhodes University in Makhanda, Eastern Cape. He was active in student politics following the 1976 uprisings. As a migrant learner, he attended Cohen High School at Port Elizabeth, the Fazeka High School in Gugulethu, Cape Town, and Crestway Senior Secondary in Retreat in Cape Town. And as a member of the Congress of South African Students, COSAC, and the Young Christian Workers, he participated with you, Logan, in the 1980 school boycotts and protests. Logan, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you, comrades, and thanks to everybody that's was able to participate, to make time to participate in this very important accounting of a very important chapter of our history of liberation. Let me start by saying that by tracing my own personal journey into the 1980 moment. In 1979, in fact, in 1977, really, I participated in a very significant protest against the killing of Steve Biko. Just after, literally a week after we learned that Steve Biko has been killed. It was over a weekend, and the following Monday, I was schooling at that time at Cowan High School and marching down Grattan Road Avenue or Road. and singing, Senzenina, 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 and isono sethu kubumnyama lamabhulu azizinja. So singing that lament of the times and marching to the nearest police station in New Brighton, and we never made it. I mean, we're scattered. A number of comrades who are in this panel will testify to that moment as participants. So we were scattered, we were arrested, we were taken to nearest police station in Algoa Park. The next moment for me was a moment of a long detention in New Brighton police station, still in that same year. And coming out of that detention, I at school find it very, very difficult to connect with everybody. There was a sense of fear at school, at Cowan High School at that moment. A lot of our leaders, previous generation of leaders, people like Dumalamani, was quite significant, had been detained and were not around. So there was a bit of fear. However, there were outstanding teachers amongst these, and a number of them had been graduated from Fort Hare University. I can only mention one of them by the name of Twigs Clip, who was my biology teacher, who later left the country. He canceled me because I'm quite young and I've been through quite a shocking experience of detention in New Brighton police cells with so-called common law criminals. And in the course of the discussions with the common law detainees, I was able to inject a sense of, there's a lot of pride at that age and a lot of assertiveness. So I was able to inject a sense of political assertiveness and an understanding of the broader political struggle. So I just want to highlight those two moments because for me, they're an important personal journey to the 1980 moment. Then the third moment is at Dora Falk in 1979. There is an organization whose contribution to the struggle is sometimes not emphasized enough. It's called Churches Urban Planning Commission. And they ran these series of training workshops with young activists. I'm at Fezeka High School together with people who have been mentioned here by Logan, Opa Leulere, Kent Mkhalipi, a number of other activists who later were to play an important role in the 1980s student boycotts. At Dora Falk, we're undergoing training in preparation for a new phase that we've entered of mobilizing, of organizing. We are exposed to a number of university students, and that is where for the first time I met Andrew Boraine, and he had come to give a session together with people like Gavin Evans, Sue Mayedel, and so on. A number of those people. Then there's a comrade there was quite active by the name of, he came from Hanover Park, the same township that Logan had mentioned earlier on, by the name of Mike Sedgwick. He's also, not perhaps acknowledged enough for the contribution that he had played, a tremendous contribution. Anyway, so now I'm kind of ready, and I belong at school at Fezeka to a group called History Society. It was really a sort of, for lack of better word, a cover for studying of Marxism. Of course, Marx is an important figure to study when you're wanting to study history in any event. So it was quite an important, so where we study the Communist Manifesto and so on in the rooms of different individuals each weekend. Now, then come end of 1979, Solomon Mahlangu has been hanged. It's a very important moment. That's kind of a building up to 1980. I come back to Port Elizabeth because I come with a sense of understanding that there is a mission to be undertaken in Port Elizabeth because the barriers between colored and African schools are so huge that in the Western Cape, I'd been exposed to a lot of the attempts to break those barriers. In fact, we used to hold our meetings from Fezeka. We go over to Livingstone High School to hold whether it's inter-school magazine meetings or it's a history society discussions. So now at Cowan High School in New Brighton, I'm exposed to a range of other activists in small ways. They are beginning to grapple with the moment. They include, a large number of them were involved in YCW, Young Christian Workers. Logan was a member of YCW. We begin to try and grapple with what's going on. I'm occasionally, every week, I have to travel to a school called Livingstone in Costin, in the colored area in Port Elizabeth, in order to facilitate the process of setting up a history society that then we can connect, we can, start to debate and discuss serious issues that face the country. Of course, we don't neglect the study of history itself as is taught at school. So there were benefits to this process for those who participated. A teacher contact of mine, a man by the name of Llewellyn Williams, he's still around and take me back and forth there. That's where I get robbed by, there used to be a lot of gangs in Costin. I get robbed. One point, my watch was taken by a group of gangsters who had just walked across us. And I remember at that moment, struggling with the fact that, do I go back to retrieve my my watch? And Mr. Williams, saying, Sheppie, let's move on. I mean, it's like, for me, very interesting, these challenges of, growing up in a working class environment and wanting to always respond by fighting back. And I could have lost my life very easily in that environment. Anyway, so 1980, we begin February to hear about what is going on in Cape Town. We start to ask ourselves, what is our role? And in small groups, people like Sipho, who later went to work in the unions, a lot of the activists that came out of the 1980 moment, those who went to work became active in the unions. He was quite active in NUMSA. So we begin to ask ourselves, using the method of YCW, Logan spoke so beautifully about it, see, judge, and act, we ask ourselves, what is our role? And we begin to understand that the schools, the laboratories, the labs that were fighting over in 1976, for instance, some of the demands that the facilities at school are in a mess, and we don't even have, we learn about science and yet we don't have even implements to demonstrate what we're learning about. So we begin these classrooms that had not been fixed, the broken windows, all the issues that Logan was speaking about in Hanover Park, they are reproduced in New Brighton and in several other schools. So we begin to ask ourselves, there is a necessity for us to begin to do something to change. So see, judge, we judge, is it, when you judge a situation that you're living in, is it in consonant with the kingdom of heaven on earth? Because that's what YCW coming out of liberation theology was all about. And we say, no, it is not. Then how do we act to transform our reality into what we would like it to be? So we get involved, and the early meetings are held in Newell High School, which was quite a prominent school in New Brighton. Of course, some are held in our school, Cowan High School. Then the other schools gradually begin to join because we're working in small groups. We're beginning to spread the network. A lot of this network relies on COSAS activists. COSAS had been repressed by this year. It has been heavily repressed. If my memory serves me correct, Wantu Zenzile was for most of the time in detention. The previous president had been arrested, was serving time on Robben Island. So weak in terms of organization at fair. So organizations such as YCW play a critical role in filling this gap. I know there's a counterpart called YCS. A lot of you may relate to it. Young Christians.
Thank you.
Were part of YCW. Then by the April.
Sheppie, you need to be rounding up now.
Yeah, I'm rounding up by April.
While I exceeded your time, if you can round up quickly in the next couple of seconds.
Okay, I just wanted to say by April 1980, there's an important event that kind of contributes in terms of morale to us, which is the liberation of Zimbabwe. And it really, that's the moment that kind of spares everything and gets us into the streets. And then, of course, later, we interact with a number of students who've been expelled from Fort Hare. The panelists here, including Vusi Pikoli, can attest to that angle of the 1980 schools boycott.
Thank you, Sheppie. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the third speaker in the first session of our program. Coming on is Kumi Naidoo, who really needs no introduction, but in 1980, he was a young 15-year-old pupil in Chatsworth. He was the international director of Greenpeace and the Secretary General of Amnesty International. He is a founding member of Helping Hands in Chatsworth. Kumi is an ambassador of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. He currently lives in London and he's eagerly and enthusiastically awaiting repatriation since early April. So, Kumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Siva. Thank you, comrades. Nice to see all of you. Many people I'm seeing who contributed to teaching me so much, so thank you. But I got to say that I'm reminded of a moment in the liberation struggle when you follow this speech like what you heard from Comrade Logan and Comrade Sheppie. You started by saying, most of the really good points I was wanting to make, comrades, have been eloquently made by the previous speakers. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. So, Siva, I know you want us to be brief. I'll be very brief. So I think I need to make one small friendly issue with the organizers of this meeting for some disinformation they put out in setting up this information. And see, they put the photograph just as I was going to say. So this photograph is not from 1980, it's from 1985. And while I concede that I had a problem with facial hair when I was in 15, I can guarantee you I did not have as much facial hair in 1980. That was in 1985 when we were getting arrested in Durban. But comrades, I want to just remind us of the words of Amilcar Cabral when he said, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. Because it's very important for me that both Comrade Sheppie and Comrade Logan both referred to YCS and YCW, right? I was not a Catholic, neither was a Christian. But those were the two organizations that inspired me the most. Because, why? They had a brutally honest class analysis about the nature of oppression, right? That's what inspired us. And if we are brutally honest with ourselves, we all were inspired not just by the struggle for racial justice, but also we wanted to say economic justice and economic transformation, because the slogan that Logan and them started in Cape Town, by the way, was an economic slogan. The first slogan we heard in Durban coming from Cape Town was, you pay our teachers peanuts, no wonder they give us monkey education, okay? So in these days, using those things are very problematic, as you know, but that's, and the other favorite slogan I remember coming from, again, from Cape Town was, the Minister of Education for Indian and college education was a guy called Andreas Steyn, S-T-E-Y-N. And the most favorite banner we had in Durban was, there's a stain in our education system, but spelled as S-T-A-I-N. And I think Alf Karrim came up with that, I think. So I just want to say my experience was very personally difficult. My mother had just committed suicide 2 weeks earlier. In fact, the strategizing for the first boycott in our school happened at the final day of the morning, 16-day morning ceremony of my mom. It happened in one of the rooms at the ceremony. Next day we were at school, and very quickly, we knew very little. Let me just be blunt about you. Coming from an Indian working class background, we knew very little, had very little information and so on. So for example, when the march eventually started, the slogan at the front of the march was, we want equality, we want equality. The younger kids at the back of the march were chanting, we want a color TV, we want a color TV, because they thought that was the slogan at the front of the march. But just to be fair, kids in white schools had color TVs, kids in black schools had no TVs. And if I'm brutally honest, I probably wanted equality and color TV almost equally at that time, right? So then our first interaction with the cops, when people like Alf, Mo, and the folks that were on the Durban campuses were beginning to get, because a lot of it happened organically, right? And I think that is the lesson of that moment. Because I think one of the criticisms of some of the older comrades when the 1980 boycotts emerged was, oh God, who are these people? Let's try and control them. Let's get them, into our structures. Where did they come from? Are they BC? Are they unity movement and so on? I think the lesson we must learn is actually to trust people who are standing up for justice, allow different ideas and so on, because trying to control it took out creatively. Now, Comrade Sheppie, I need to say apology to you because in the aftermath of 1980, coming from Chatsworth, right? Me, my brother Coven, who eventually became vice president of Sansko, some of you might have remember him, and many other activists from Chatsworth, we wanted to join COSAS, right? Because it made sense. We said, and we considered you as our leader, right? And the COSAS national leadership, but we had no contact. But the situation in Durban, some of our older comrades, I shouldn't say all, some of these older comrades strongly said, you can't join COSAS because of the situation with Inkatha and Buthelezi and so on. For those of you who don't remember, to organize in KwaZulu the Legislative Assembly controlled townships like Amlazi and Kwamashu was 1,000 times more difficult to organize in townships like what we call the Port Natal Administration Board, townships like Lamontville and Chesterville, for example. So I think when I reflect on it, I think we should have pushed harder and said, even though there's lots of risk involved in it, the imperative of unity against the apartheid logic of racial division, even though, yes, more people would have got arrested and so on. By the way, I should pay tribute that we did go to COSAS meetings. We did. There would be random things we would hear in town. And I remember going to one meeting with Comrade Naidoo, who was murdered in 1988 by Eugene de Kock and company, being at one meeting. And I'll be honest with you, right? We used to go to those meetings, sing Zulu freedom songs. We learned the Zulu freedom songs very quickly, sing it as if we knew every word we were saying. But I'll be honest with you, half the time we knew the songs and the words, we didn't know exactly the actual meaning of the words, but it didn't really matter because we trusted the comrades that we were with. But I think it's important to look at the question of how naive we were. But even in the naivety, we had a class analysis. We might not have called it class, right? But I think if there's one error that we've made as a people and as activists who were involved at that time, is that we bought into the lie post-1994 that we can deliver justice to people within the brutality of the capitalist system. That is, and I know we were told there's no alternative and we all moved in different directions and tried to work within that system. But if you look at what is happening now in the world today, with the rise of struggles on racial justice in the US and elsewhere, and how they are being connected to class, I think it's a mistake we made in our reconstruction. I just want to conclude by saying, just one light thing I should say, that, when I had just learned in 1980 school boycott, when I went to one meeting in town, somebody taught me the slogan when I was 15, Amandla Wetu. So in the first demonstration, when the police and the army came, when 3 of our schools had united and were marching against them, and they brought cops from Kwamashu and Amlazi and so on. So we see all these cops there. So I start the slogan, Amandla Wetu, and the younger kids think we are trying to win favor with the Black African comrades, cops, and that I was saying, we love Soweto. So suddenly 1,500 students were saying, we love Soweto, we love, and these cops are thinking, what the fuck? We're not from Soweto. So let me conclude by saying that if there's one thing that we should take out of this very positive reflections of where we've come from, is to have the courage to do what Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the anti-colonial movement in Guinea-Bissau, asked us to do, when he said, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And comrades, I think we must reflect right now whether in fact some of the choices we made at the moment of transition and the path that we are on is ever going to be able to deliver justice to the majority of people. If we do not change the economic system quite substantially, I don't think, and this is not about, distribution here and there, fundamental transformation is what it's going to take. And I conclude with this slogan, or not slogan, with this wisdom from a very close comrade of mine, but I love him very much, so I'm not going to mention his name, but he and I were in sort of the Young Communist League structures at some point. And when I was the head of the Adult Literacy Coalition, 94, 96, he comes to see me. By then he's in a job, in a top job, like chief director. And by this stage, you know, chief director equals Mercedes-Benz or BMW, whatever. So he's coming to visit me. He was late. He parks the car about 6 blocks away, but I could see him from where I was because he was driving this posh car. So when he comes, I say, hey, comrade, I'm not going to make any value judgment. Why didn't you just bring your camera? He said, no, but you know what, comrade, let me explain to you the situation I am. He said, I want to make clear, I'm still a communist at heart, a socialist in orientation. It's just that right now I'm a capitalist in practice, but I'll come back. Let me say, comrades, many of us have to come back. If we don't come back, our contributions to the struggle in the past would add up to very little because we are on a road to disaster. It's there looking at us. We have to do something different, something bold, and we need to be courageous enough to let young people again lead the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi. We are, in fact, really struggling to keep up with time. I'm going to give just a minute for a discussion, and I'm going to ask Lennox, Klaas, and Jabu to be very brief, a minute each, before we can move on to section 2. Lennox? Some reflections from our 3 speakers that have already spoken.
Yes, thank you very much. You see, the fun part of this panel discussion is the coming together of people who share a particular outlook. As a result, you are not going to encounter a great deal of disagreements. Allow me then to say, I extend a great deal of gratitude to the organizers of this forum for not only take us this route of reflecting this very, very important period of our time, but I think it should go beyond that to try and say, how do we recalibrate? Because as the previous speaker has said, so much has gone wrong, and we can only undo that once we have spotted the target. Indeed, the period we're talking about was very, very important in so many ways. One of those, it was an honor and rewarding to be part of those activities, and in turn expecting very, very little except some of the programs that we decided to embrace. One of those would be the document that was celebrated yesterday, Freedom Charter. I'm sure we agree with the president of the country when he says, much as it was relevant at the time, it is still so relevant today. You see, the situation in Port Elizabeth, colleagues, was different. At the time, the situation in Port Elizabeth, in fact, each and every street in Port Elizabeth, not only in 1980, but as early as 2 years back, would have a person who was either in Robben Island for their activism or in exile for their activism, or probably dead. Then when 1980 came, that's the kind of reception that it received. That's why when we say it was the eve of this political activism, that's why end of the day we talk of 3 presidents born and produced by that period in Port Elizabeth. I'm talking Wantu Zenzile, Sheppie, and Lulu Johnson. It was not an accident that we were able to have these 3 dynamic presidents. They were born by the practical conditions on the ground that confronted all of us as young as 17 and 18 years old. If I might, I don't know if I've hit my 2-minute mark.
No, you well exceeded it,
Okay,
Lennox. So if you
okay,
can just
I'll
round up, we'll give Jabu an opportunity to.
Don't
just
worry.
We're
I'll come
really
back.
running out
Don't
of
worry.
time. Yeah.
Don't worry, I'll
Thanks
come
for your
back.
comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jabu,
Thank you.
for those of you who don't know, Jabu, Lennox was in school in 1980 and went into exile and served the democratic government at GCIS and in radio. Thanks so much, Lennox. Jabu, let's hear a short 1 minute from you.
Afternoon, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can hear you clearly.
Okay, afternoon, comrades. It's just chairperson who made my duty easy. I'm not a public speaker. I'm a person who does work on the ground. In short, is that there was that school boycott. My history is long. I won't even talk about it and start talking about it. My comrades knows me very well. And my friend also that I haven't, some of them, Mo and others, I always see them in Joburg and so on. But the person that I haven't seen for ages is Sheik, not Sheik, Andrew Boraine. I miss him a lot, I haven't seen him for ages.
Well, you see him now.
Yeah, so what happened is that in Cape Town, where by then we were not at school, but were actively involved in terms of setting up organizations and setting up structures in terms of women, school, trade unions, and everything, and so on, even the student movement. So the issue of school children not going back to school, it was just a problem, a headache, and so on. It was defeating the purpose of what we were looking for and what we wanted to do. So we decided to go down to Cape Town through contacts with Comrade Boraine and other student leaders, and also through Ibrahim Patel and other comrades. So we ended up landing in Cape Town because it was the nerve center of that school boycott of 1980s. We went because it was more of the, when we caucused and so on, we found that the Black Township school were the ones that who did not want to go back to school. We had a 3-day meeting, tough, hard, Tembambeta and different, also people from YCS and some different students and so on. We ended up convincing them to go back to school. So, but it was an issue of a problem that was, that I'll say, the problem was the issue of comrades not understanding and defining the issue of tactics and strategies. To say the tactics, your tactics can be contradictory in order to achieve your principles. So those
Jabu,
students.
you should be rounding up now. We really.
Oh, thank you, comrades. I'm finished. Okay. Can I say, by then the boycott, I'll say that was the end of the boycott in Cape Town. But then we went down to PE, we did the same. That was the end of boycott. Thank you.
Jabu undeniably played quite a big role in the coordination of this boycott. He worked at the Christian Institute and was directly involved with the 1976 uprisings. And he had a close collaboration with leaders from the Natal Indian Congress in that particular period, including the likes of Mewa Ramgoban, Yunus Muhammad, Zak Yaqub, and he was largely responsible for setting up structures, COSAS and AZASU, throughout the length and breadth of the country. We're going to move on to section 2 now, and session 2, and our first speaker hails from my province, Natal, as it was known then, and now for Zulu Natal. Frank Meintjies is our next speaker, and he's going to speak for just 5 minutes, Frank. He is currently the visiting research fellow at Wits University. He was previously the director of the Hlanganisa Institute of Development and formerly the national coordinator of Mandela Day and chief director of communications and resource development in the government's RDP office. In 1980, he was then a young student at the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg campus. Over to you, Frank. The floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Your mic, Frank, you're on mute. Frank, you're on mute.
Okay.
Right.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Yeah, good to see you all. I'll just dive right into it. So I had been active at university and UWC the year before 1980. That period wasn't such a vibrant year in political terms due to, I think, the excessive repression, particularly against Black consciousness organizations. And it was a period of regrouping. But it's interesting how 1980 then became the year that pulled so many things together. It became that turning point in the same way that June 76 was the turning point. I think we can draw a line from 1980 unto the point of liberation. And that period saw the huge mobilization taking place at every level. Interesting about 1980 and 76 is the involvement of children or the very young. I don't think it starts off as a political activist to be our strategy to involve children in struggle, but it's a sign of the depth of oppression and repression. So even if you look at what happens in Palestine, you see that in the end, even children looking at their circumstances, the deprivation they face, the levels of frustration, and also looking at their future, which in such cases looks extremely bleak, are moved then to take up action. I think another theme that comes through out of 1980 is the way in which violence operates in these societies. So again, in South Africa, many do not immediately orientate to that as a strategy, particularly because we don't have the wherewithal. But often violence is imposed on that. And we've seen that in those struggles. More than 500 people killed in 76, 40 killed in the Western Cape alone in 1980. So again, they're feeling moved to respond by throwing stones at Caspers, and it would become a forward-moving theme. Another theme is what I think was mentioned earlier is the multi-pronged nature of struggle. So at some points you will have worker organization taking the lead, at other points a student organization taking the lead. And interestingly, in 1980, we were actually drawing the interconnections between these different sites of struggle. And we've talked earlier on about the red meat boycott, the Fatties and Monies boycott, and the bus boycotts. And in this way, while organizing on campuses, we use those struggles of the workers to actually make the point that Kumi was making, which is that fundamental to many of the problems we face is a society that excludes millions of people. In the case of the African people, draws them off the land and says, we're going to offer you civilization in inverted commas and a life in dignity. But then in fact, forcing people into hostels, into living precariously, into survival from month to month, very much the same situation that we have today. Last comment is about organizations, the big organizations and the institutionalities of struggle. So struggle often begins by mobilization on the ground. But in the end, there are the organizations. And in 1980, the ANC had declared it the year of the Charter, and SACTU had also declared it the year of the worker. And organization is important to contain, but also to hold and then to direct struggle so that it actually becomes much more sustainable. So these things are always a yin and yang. They play off each other. And often, in some cases, the organization doesn't actually initiate the activity on the ground, but it is important to come in and provide that guidance and that strength. I'll stop there. So thank you all.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for being very disciplined with time, your inside time. Our next speaker is Karrim, who hails from my hometown, Tongat. He was the president of the SRC in 1980-81 at the erstwhile University of Durban Westville. He was also part of the small team that was negotiating a democratic SRC. He led the boycott in UDW in 1980 and participated in various civic and political campaigns. He was also the editor of Ukuza and the coordinator of the Natal Flood Relief Committee. He was also the head of public education in the South African Parliament and is currently with Macron to look at the use of ICT in developing state capability. Altaf, the floor is yours. 5 minutes out.
Your volume muted, Alf. Put your sound on, Alf. Not yet. You need to unmute, press the mute button, which is on the extreme left at the bottom of your screen. Or then you have to pull out the,
Okay, not yet, okay.
Okay, I think Alf is having some problems. Let's move on. We'll come back to Alf. Let's get Vinny on just to save time. Venitha Pillay was a student at UDW in 1980. She's a researcher on gender issues with specialization in women and education. She's published extensively on women academics, motherhood, women in leadership, gender equity, sexuality, schooling and power, and feminist approaches to research. Vinny, the floor is yours.
Sipho, how are you?
Great, Vinny.
Okay, I will do my very best to keep to the time, and thank you for inviting me. I want to talk about two achievements I think that all of us in the 1980s shared, and that was an ability to develop organizational skills. I think we were very young. We were teenagers, and most of us in our early 20s, and we held responsibilities that were far beyond our years. But we were able to mobilize masses of people. And we did it I think in a very ordered way, in a way that was constructive to the agenda on hand. And we were able to actually build a kind of consciousness of the long-term struggle through our organizing. And the moment that kind of sticks out in my mind is, it was after the Black Wednesday at UDW. We had all been beaten up. Altav and Mo will remember this well. And we had gone into hiding, and then student leaders were detained. And those of us who were not, and Mo and I were one of those people who were not, and Altav was detained, had come back to campus. And of course, we'd gone through the debate of, do we go back or not? We eventually did go back to campus, and I don't remember our thinking about the time. But I do recall very clearly sitting outside what was known as the main hall at UDW. And the hall was packed to capacity with angry students. One, because their leaders were detained. Two, because we were back. We asked them to come back. And I do recall the conversation with Mo where we were sitting and thinking, what do we tell the students when we go back in there? And I can't remember what we did, but when we came out of that meeting, which was very tense, very difficult, we managed to be able to calm a crowd of very angry, fairly, volatile minds at the time, and young people whose volatility, of course, was much greater than than older people. But we managed to calm them down, and we managed to say why we needed to be back and to actually get people to follow the line. I think that was an ability that we took forward in our lives, to argue a point, to be able to show our connections and to organize in everything we've done well. And I think those were lessons we learned on the ground in the struggle, which no book could ever teach us, no equal education, nothing, no schooling could ever teach us. So for me, that was a huge achievement. The other very big achievement was the way in which we practiced non-racialism in an extremely racialized context. So, we were at UDW, a so-called Indian university. We were organizing Indian students. The masses of Indian schools converged at UDW campus. It was a sea of Indians, but our approach to this moment in our history was always a non-racial one. And for most of us, the conscious way in which we discarded the tag of Indian, and we were not involved in an Indian struggle, we were involved in a South African struggle for non-racialism. I think that set a very important agenda in a very divided society. So I think that was a second really strong achievement. But the two things I kind of lament the most is, we talked about, our call was for a free and equal education for all. And of course, we wanted quality education, but I think we've lost, well, we did not win that battle for quality education. I think quality in terms of our education system is extremely uneven. And in apartheid days, it was, divided very clearly racially. Those racial barriers are not so obvious, but yet they still remain. And so even though we all may have the same kind of syllabus, we still are not receiving the same quality of education. And I think that's one of the tragedies of the time. And the last point I want to make is the thing that we completely lost is we focused on non-racialism, we focused on the struggle, a liberation movement, but we did not ever talk about the triple oppression of women in this particular battle. We hardly ever focused on gender, and it doesn't surprise me that we are one of the most gender oppressive societies in the world. The fact that we have the highest rate of gender-based violence bears testimony to our history. And we did not pay a significant attention to the issues of gender. In fact, our leadership was very masculine, very male, as is of course evident in this panel. But this panel is a product of history. And I think that is something we failed in significantly as well. So if I had to go back and change anything, that's really what I would be able to, that's what I would be able to talk about.
Thank you, Venitha. Capture time, brilliant. That was Venitha Pillay. Now let's go to Altaf Karrim, who is ready to roll. Altaf?
Hi, people, comrades. I am going to try and keep the time as well. I must agree first with Veni. I was going to make that as a point that I think the whole gender issue was very much lost in terms of what we did. And for what it's worth, people like Veni, I don't know if Maggie is listening, were some of the most powerful leaders on that campus. And I think we lost a very big opportunity in terms of that. I'm going to be talking more about UDW in the sense that that's what I know. And that presents some very interesting questions and issues that we need to address. And I'm going to do this in looking at 3 dimensions. Dimension 1, it was probably early March 1980 on a Sunday afternoon that we had come back from Cato Manor, looking at working with community there in terms of the removals that was taking place. By that stage, we had been very active on campus. There was a cafe boycott. There was a Pinky Mahodi issue where an African student was not allowed to be staying at hostel. There was an engagement that we were undertaking and fighting administration at that time to have a democratic SRC. But that evening, yes, that Sunday evening, a lot changed. The thing that changed was that dear Barry Kisnasamy, people recall him, we heard a knock on the door. We were sitting in a flat in Scala Mansions on one end of the Kashba. And he was telling us that you Indian students haven't yet come out on boycott, you must come out. First, we thought, you know what, we got a lot of things going on campus, particularly the formation of that democratic SRC, and maybe we should stick with that rather than come out on boycott. But having slept on the issue, the next day, the next morning, and I remember Jayendra being there, we decided, no, we have to go for this boycott. We have to join the national campaigns that were taking place. That changed our lives. Yes, we were always worried about security branch attention, but that changed our lives in the sense that it resulted in hiding, detentions, riot squad pressure on us, and a whole range of things at that time. But it was a major, major learning curve for all of us, as Venny was rightfully pointing out. The second part, the second dimension that was what was happening on campus. The second dimension, what was happening outside of campus. As students, we got very involved in what was happening within communities, Phoenix, and a range of communities. In fact, every set of students at UDW, where there was a set of students that were involved in their own local area in terms of the civic and local issues that were there. That began to radicalize us, began to give us ideas about our role as students, going beyond us just being students. I must say, though, it also contributed to students making those struggles more energetic, making those struggles at a community level more militant. And that was the second dimension that, to me, came across through in the whole 1980 period. But in that time, we also met very formidable activists who began to shape us. And the thing that shaped us were very senior activists like Praveen and them that we had related to. But what also shaped us was the whole theory of organization that we began to learn there. I would advise at some point that we need to investigate, interrogate the learning that we did. And it got encapsulated in what famously became called OCMS, Organizing, Consciousness, Mobilization, and Struggle. That was the second dimension, and I'm raising both of that with a purpose. The third dimension of what had happened in 1980 was a lot of questions that we were asking. And I think Venny, Mo, others will recall that. There were multiple questions that were being asked, but the main question that was being asked, particularly from someone like me, whose dad told me that your liberation comes from education. You'll change your life if you're educated. The question that became is, how do we win a revolution?
Alf, you've got 1 more minute.
Okay, all right, I'll stop there then.
Good, no, speak, you've got 1 more minute.
Okay, the question became, how do we win a revolution? So at that point, I remember having lots of debates with people, and we began to understand this theory of organization and mass mobilization, the role of masses and ungovernability. Why I'm raising that is after all that struggle that we have, within my family, within my friend, they'll all ask me, was it worth it? I had a senior activist not more than 2 weeks ago who said we messed it up, you know? But I wanted to just leave it with this thought, and that's why I'm raising this question. We didn't mess it up. And I think that's the one thing we must begin to correct. If we take that point of view, we're going to go into the future a little bit blind. Why we didn't mess it up is that we need to distinguish between democracy and government. The struggle created a democracy for us. But government is not democracy. Government is an institutionalization of the practice of democracy. Our failure is on the latter. It's not on the former. The victory was a major one, and we must keep that in mind. What we have to consider now, how do we make government work, and how do we continue and create the condition so that the socialism or the liberalism that we all intended begin to achieve itself in the end.
Thank you, Alpha. Point well taken. Let's move on. Our next speaker is Andrew Boraine. Andrew was on the executive of the SRC at the University of Cape Town in the period 1978 to 1979. He was elected the president of NUSAS in 1980 and 81. And Andrew was detained in Durban on the 16th of June, 1980, 40 years ago, where he was held under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act. He was subsequently detained under the Internal Security Act in Cape Town and at Pretoria Central Prison in 1981. Andrew was banned for 5 years in June 1981. His banning order was lifted in 1983 at the time of the tri-term elections. He served on the executive of the UDF between 1983 and 1985, and he was also an underground MK operative from 1986 to 1989. Andrew Boraine, the floor is yours.
Sipho, thanks so much for this opportunity, and greetings to so many old friends and comrades. It's so good to see you all still living. And as I say that, let's remember those that have died over the last 40 years that are no longer with us, particularly the late Wantu Zinzile. Sipho, just to thank you for this opportunity. This is not just, I think, important educationally and historically and politically what you've done now, but also emotionally. This period shaped us as young people. And maybe, Altaf, we could say, not only didn't we mess it up at the time, but maybe if the class of 1980 had been given all the reins of power, we would have done a lot better over the last 40 years. It's difficult when old toppies like ourselves are asked to remember events of 40 years ago. But thank you for the opportunity to dig out old images and pamphlets and speeches. And I particularly want to perhaps comment a little bit about the role of white students, or on students at historically white campuses that at that stage we organized under the banner of NUSAS. And Selvin, if you could just move on to the next one, please. This is quite a well-known shot from UCT in April or May 1980 in response. And I remember being shown this picture a few months later by our old friend Craig Williamson under interrogation. And it took me 2 days to explain what he wanted to know, what from the schools comes revolution actually meant. That was not an easy question at the time. Thanks. Let's have the next slide. So I remember being speaking on campus at the time at UCT, and we were trying to encourage white students to also take part in the student and school boycotts. And one of the people, a young white student, got up and asked me, why should we be boycotting? There's nothing wrong with our education. It's kind of their education that's the problem, not ours. And I thought it would just be useful to just quickly touch on my response at the time, because I think it's relevant today in terms of the new Black Lives Matter movement and addressing systems and structures of whiteness in our country and in the world. And I said at the time, just as Black people and students reject racist education they received, so too do we as white students reject the racist education we received. Just as Black students reject second-rate education, which prepares them to become workers and laborers in an unjust economic system, so too do we reject our education, which equips us to play out the role of the oppressor. Just as Black students condemn the distorted textbooks, which ignore the long history of resistance, so too do we reject the bias of our own education, white education, which obscures the nature of 300 years of domination and privilege. And that if you look at the lack of untransparent education in places like the United States today, nothing has really changed. Black pupils do not demand equal education with whites. Their demand is for a totally new education system for all. This should be our demand as well. And then just if we can go on to the next slide. I also went on to say in that same talk, we must be clear in our minds on one thing, though. The boycott of classes, which is taking place at the moment, is not just about broken windows. It's not just about the lack of textbooks. It's about poor housing, low wages, lack of transport, bad working conditions, and above all, the complete absence of political power for the majority of South Africans. And I think this was absolutely fundamental to what we were trying to do at the university campuses, both the black and the white university campuses at the time, as others have said there, Vinny and Alf and Frank. It wasn't just about the struggles on campuses for student rights and SRCs and student privileges. It was the connection of the student struggles on campuses to the majority struggles, and how do we as students, and particularly white students, take our lead from the majority. And maybe just a comment in passing, it struck me, being particularly absent during the time of Fees Must Fall a few years ago, that lack of connection to wider struggles and working class struggles. And it focused very much inward on the rights and privileges of students. So I won't go into detail here. I mean, this was a little bit
One more minute you have, Andrew.
Okay. So Logan and others have situated the context of the schools boycott. The schools boycott came out of and was related to wider struggles. And one of the bigger ones that took place on all the campuses in 1980 was the Release Mandela campaign launched by the Sunday Post in January 80. Thanks. Can we move on? And students at the time, one of our jobs was to try and analyze what was going on. And I dug out a pamphlet that we had produced back in June 1980, which was circulated on all the campuses, 4 trends comparing what had happened in June 76 and what was happening in 1980. And Logan and Sheppie and others, I think, have covered some of the debates around boycott as a tactic versus boycott as a principle. So I won't go into that. Just let's move on to the next one. And Siva, I will finish this in your time slot, don't worry. In the same one, I think that we spent quite a lot of time during that time talking about tactics and strategy. I think there was quite a high degree of consciousness amongst students, amongst scholars at schools, and in the communities. The awareness of boycotts as a strategic political weapon, the relationship between short-term demands and long-term goals, the growing link between community and trade union issues and the national democratic struggle, and the increasing use of mass mobilization. Thank you. Let's just, next one. And so if you continued this trend, there's the Wilson Roundtree strike the next year, which was connected. And I couldn't resist putting up some anti-boycott graffiti I photographed in 1981 on a street in Cape Town. Not everyone supported the I don't eat Wilson Roundtrees. But if you remember, comrades, at the time, we also commemorated the death of Bobby Sands from the IRA in the Maize Block in detention, as well as protests against forced removals from Nyanga Bush. Thank you. Next one. And I think the main point I'd like to make is that in 1981, the schools boycotts of 1980 led to an assertion of non-racial student unity around the Anti-Republic Day campaign. And certainly, I certainly remember Alf being quite worried about me coming as a white student leader onto UDW at the time. But it was, and I think I was the first NUSAS leader to speak on historically Black campuses since the Sasso breakaway in 1968. So it was quite a significant moment of NUSAS, COSAS, and AZASO working together. And just the final 2 slides. I think Jabu, in that picture on the top right of myself talking with Comrade Wantu, you're at that meeting. It was in a secret hideout to the north of Johannesburg that we were meeting and trying to build those non-racial alliances. And of course, all this 1980, 81, 82 led to my final slide. And of course, that's the launch of UDF in the 20th of August. That's historic meeting in Rocklands. And here are 3 young organizers. That's Jonathan de Vries turned away there. And I can see Ruth and Gulam in the background there. Also the marshals. Trevor Manuel trying to look as though he knew how to work a walkie-talkie at the time to keep people under control there. Thanks, Siva.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to session 3. And in fact, in session 2, we had Sipho, Shezi, and Vusi Pikoli to give us comments, but we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give Vusi 2.5 minutes and Sipho 2.5 minutes. This time is equitably distributed to both these comrades, and let's check how disciplined they are in keeping up to time. So, Sipho, the floor is yours. Sipho was the president of DCO Makiyani Youth League in 1979. The Youth League worked to counteract the influence of the IFP here in KZN, and was responsible for setting up a number of youth organizations in Pietermaritzburg during the 80s. Sipho, the floor is yours. 2.5 minutes.
No, thanks very much, Comrade Siva, and thanks very much, comrades. I think I'm going to probably take less than 2 minutes.
I'll take 2.5.
No, I'll take less than 2. I think that there are just a couple of issues that comrades have highlighted, which I'd just like to give a commentary on. I mean, the first one, in terms of the era of the 1980s, was this, migration, from mobilization to organization. I think that is one thing that I think that we need to be proud of, and comrades have highlighted, that issue. I think that capability remains as relevant then as it is now. But it was also what made the period of the 1980s a qualitative moment with reference to the moment of the mid-1970s, in particular the 1976, right up to 1979. The second issue is the whole issue of political consciousness, that comrades have been talking about. I think that whatever, mobilization and organization that were achieved at that time was underpinned by a very high level of political consciousness. And I think that that is quite significant to note, because I think the current moment actually calls for that. So when we talk about the need for transformation, when we talk about the need of, dealing with issues of state capture, issues of corruption, you realize that the issue of high level of consciousness is as relevant now as it was relevant then. The third issue is the issue of the non-racial character, of that struggle. And I think all comrades, without exception, they've hammered, on that issue. But I'm highlighting it because I think that is really what, also was a defining moment, in terms of the role of the 80s, the extent to which we actually lived the notion of non-racialism in our struggle, And I think, in my opinion, what we lived then remain as relevant now as it was, during that era. So it's quite an important, element to note. And the final point is this interconnection that comrades talk about with reference to the different facets, of our struggle, and how the ability to actually, pull together this interconnectedness became a tool for mass mobilization of society across the racial divide, across the political spectrum. I think it was as a result of the ability to actually pull that together that we're in a position, for instance, to situate the United Democratic Front in the manner that we did, and at the same time also be able to harmonize some very deep ideological, contradictions, that existed at the time, but we're able to actually harmonize them together for one common national objective. Let me just highlight those issues. Thanks so much. Great. Bye.
Thank you so much, Comrade Shezi. We have Vusi Pikoli. Vusi got into trouble with the law in 1980. He was then a student at the University of Fort Hare. Vusi, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, comrades, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me start off by quoting Frantz Fanon when he said that each generation must, out of its relative obscurity, discover its mission to either fulfill or betray. What happened in 1980 was basically a build on the previous struggles that were fought. In 1980, I was at Fort Hare, but we were continuing with the tradition of the struggles at the University of Fort Hare, dating back to the 40s and to the 50s. But then also we were inspired by the big strike in 1973 at Fort Hare, and the Frelimo rallies throughout the country just before the independence of Mozambique and Angola. And obviously, April 1980, as Sheppie had mentioned, had an influence on our struggles. I'm raising these to make the necessary connections, as Sipho has just said. Whether one is a Marxist or not, but historical and analytical materialism helps us to properly analyze our situation. But briefly, let me say that I agree with all the panelists that the 1980 struggles was more qualitative in nature compared to the previous struggles. And I must also indicate that it also involved mobilization of children who were still at school at the time. In 1980, I was doing my fourth and final year law degree at Fort Hare. And then this brought about a growing militancy and more dedicated focus, on fighting all the apartheid institutions and their symbols. And also, during that time, we were able to swell the ranks of the African National Congress and Umkhonto weSizwe. What I will need to talk about now is post-1994, but tracing it back to those previous struggles, that most of those who were involved in the 1980s sort of formed the backbone of the new public service. Sipho Shezi included as one of the earlier DGs in government. But of course, I think we need to look at what is our current task now. We should go beyond reminiscing, going beyond being nostalgic about the past, and say, what are the demands of the day? And I think this is where then we should locate the role that we need to play, those who were involved earlier in our struggle, in the building of a capable, a developmental, professional, and ethical state. I think this is the urgent task that all of us face.
Thank you, thank you, Vusi.
And I think we should keep that focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vusi, well said. We're going to go on to our last session, session 3, and we have Zubeida Jaffer as being part of the panel with Mo and Karuna, but unfortunately, Comrade Zubeida is unwell. I chatted to her earlier, and then she made reference to the 1980 student revolt. She was then a young 22-year-old journalist with the Cape Times, and prior to that, she was had a short stint with the Rand Daily Mail. Fortunately, we have an excerpt which he sent to us from a book which is called My Generation. And she said, I'm sending this page, which refers to the start of the boycott. I covered all the stories, including the impressive evolution of the committee of 1981. It led me to the story of the police killings on the Cape Flats on June 16th, 17th, 1980. The story was published on the 24th of July, 1980, and changed my life forever. And she's asking us to please look out for an engagement to mark the 40th anniversary of this moment soon. So thanks for that, Zubi. Unfortunately, don't have time to read 2 excerpts from your book, but be assured that the 24th of July, we will certainly zoom in when we celebrate the anniversary of the killings that took place, of which you so eloquently wrote about in the Cape Times. So we're moving to session 3. The time is now nearly 20 to 5. We want to conclude the session by 5 o'clock. Our first speaker in this session is Karuna Mohan. And Karuna hails from Pietermaritzburg. In 1980, she was the treasurer of the Black Student Society at the University of Natal PMB. And she was responsible for managing and accounting for the funds raised and spent in the Schools Boycott in PMB. In 1983, she was the student representative to the UDF in Pietermaritzburg. She was an activist of the Natal Indian Congress, and Karuna worked on setting up the civic and women's organizations and persuaded Hindu organizations to support the struggles against apartheid injustices. Karuna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The period 1978 to around 1986 shaped my life on a path beyond my closeted barriers that I had sprung from. My paradigm shifted from middle-class comfort to critical thinking, to supporting working class struggles and humble work at grassroots. The broad struggle was about getting enfranchisement. The revolution, which hasn't been completed, was about social and economic transformation. 1980 was the defining moment. To elucidate this, I will cover 3 critical areas: learning to practice non-racial unity, developing accountability and responsibility, and lastly, working with the masses. Those of us who were students at liberal white campuses in 1980 had a ready-made petri dish for racial interaction at the university. During the day, we led a life of non-racial interaction, and at night, we went back to our designated areas of residence. We learned very fast that there were white students who were willing to build a non-racial society. And there were those white students who wanted to keep apartheid intact, especially the students that came from the Den Rhodesia to study in Pietermaritzburg. We also learned that there were African leaders who were willing to work with the South African government, such as Chief Gacha Buthelezi. The NUSA students on our campus were resourced with student funding, offices, skills, and in building a non-racial future, we became firm friends. In fact, at the beginning of this session, Andrew was telling me, hey, all the oldies are here. We actually became comrades over the years. The Black students at the Federal Theological Seminary in Mbali were another grouping of students that we interacted with and built non-racial relations. Without the participation of all the racial groups in the 1980 boycott, we wouldn't have been successful people now that we are. We interacted with all racial groups despite apartheid. In our collective in Pietermaritzburg and in Durban that was led by the Natal Indian Congress, all ethnic groups were accepted as equal. We were working towards a non-racial society, and it did not matter whether our forefathers' ships sailed from Madras, Calcutta, Mumbai, or Surat. The Indian community had already begun to accept inter-ethnic, interlinguistic, and even interreligious marriages. This perhaps gave me the edge to actually, and my generation, the edge to recognize that the interracial sphere would shape the future of South Africa, and that we are Africans born on the African continent. The principle of a non-racial society was non-negotiable, as was the leadership of the African working class. By 1992, when I was elected treasurer of the ANC Women's League in the Midlands region, it was a majority African women who voted for me to represent them and their interests. In 1980, when I was the treasurer of the Black Student Society, we did not have grants from donor agencies. We did not have allocations from the university. This came much later in the years. We developed a practice of raising funds. We worked very hard to do this, and we also developed a practice of accounting for funds. Accountability for funds meant that we needed to be honest with each other, and we had to prioritize what would be funded and what won't be funded. As a collective of students, we often had competing interests that needed to be funded, and we had limited funds. When consensus could not be reached, it was left to the treasurer to make the decision. I learned that this was a tough call. Decisions on spending are made based on what is for the common good. When a leader makes this call, friends, family, and personal interests get set aside, and it is your conscience that dictates what must be done. This learning that I got in 1980 held me in good stead when I was treasurer of the Women's League and had to deal with a number of competing interests for funding and saying no to demands that were wasteful and fruitless that would have funded the bad habits of leaders. In terms of working with the masses, my baptism into fire, into mass meetings and rallies took place during the boycotts. We arranged a number of student meetings at the university and held successful mass meetings for high school students in Northdale to protest baton charges against the high school students. In these meetings, the NIC leadership in Pietermaritzburg often came and addressed, and that was largely Mr. A.S. Chetty. Flowing on from mass meetings, the Pietermaritzburg Combined Ratepayers Association organized a mass meeting to protest the unfair rating system and denounce the local affairs committee. And opposition to the Pietermaritzburg City Council and their efforts to co-opt Indians and Coloreds was a theme of the decade of the 80s. And the 1980 boycott grouping worked on many of these campaigns, both in the Indian and the Colored communities, as well as in Subantu, Ashdown, Mbali, and Edendale. We spent most of our vacation of 1980-1981 doing household surveys and carried out house meetings and assisted the residents of newly created Bombay Heights in stages 9 and 10 in Northdale to engage with City Council. We set up structures in the communities and shared our skills with working class people. We had a close alliance with unionists and did the footwork for the NIC leadership to reach out to the masses during 1983 and 1984. If the 1980 boycotts did not happen and the students in Cape Town did not protest, I perhaps would not be here with you today sharing my experiences, having learned about strategy and tactics and the power of the boycott. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Karuna. Chapter time, thank you so much. We are almost concluding the third session of our Zoom meeting. And coming on now is Moshe, who's going to be the last speaker. Mo really needs no introduction. He is a thought leader. in infrastructure financing on the African continent, specializing in energy, transport, ICT, and water sectors. He is a former student activist and leader in the 1980s. He was also an active member of the ANC underground and specialized in intelligence. He was a negotiator, part of the negotiating team at CODESA, the multi-party talks, and played a leading role in shaping the intelligence dispensation for a democratic South Africa. Mo, the floor is yours. You've got 5 minutes, crew.
Thank you very much for having me. It's so great to see many of the old faces there. I want to agree with Andrew that we all look like bullies, but it's just great to see everyone. I want to touch on a few points. Some have been mentioned, but in respect to the 1980s, what was a phenomenal moment for me was that it gave rise to a non-racial ANC underground. And of course, you could understand at that time, there were two big debates occurring. The first debate was that should the liberation of South Africa be limited only to African comrades who were willing to make the sacrifices and join the underground struggles and join MK? Or should there be a large proportion also of Indian and colored comrades to join the military struggles? And you'll find that the 1980s led to that. This is why you had in Western Cape, you had a large amount of students who were generated from the 1980 boycotts who went and took that decision to join MK. So was it in KwaZulu-Natal, and Kumi mentioned someone who was killed by the name of Lenny Naidoo. But Lenny was also a product of the 1980s generation. And so too was a range of other comrades who then started to join the underground. And I must say, there was a big debate at the time. And the debate was, should we concentrate on mass organization? And that is working with the people in the townships, in the formations that led to the UDF, or should there be a migration of people in large numbers into the MK formation? And if we were going to do that, how would we also do that on a non-racial basis? And of course, that was a major thing that happened. And I think this is why the strength or the compliment must be given to ANC leadership of the time that ensured that there was a non-racial character even in the formations of the underground and the military. The second point I want to make, and because it is quite popular now, to look back at our negotiation process and say, was it necessary? And did we make too much of compromises, etc., in the negotiations? And when we look back to what we have today, we want to see it through the lens of the compromises that were made in the negotiation process. Let me tell you, I reject that thinking completely. Because at the time of the negotiations, this country of ours, this beloved country of ours, was on the abyss, and Benny will smile at that word, was at the abyss of civil war. We were entering into chaos, and the only way forward was to reach, to put down and to silence the guns. And I think the decision to silence the guns through the negotiation process was absolutely correct. And it is something that all of us as South Africans, this generation, the generation before us, the generation to come, must celebrate. The negotiations created for us the basis to construct a democratic state. Alf very eloquently made the point of a democratic state, and the outcome of that democratic state may not be what we want today. It may have not led to the basis of creating a more enduring or sustainable social democracy, but at least the basis to do that is there. Secondly, I want to add related to that, because it is also popular to look at what are the choices we have today, whether we could embark upon socialism, which I think all of us at our heart really do believe in terms of a more equitable social democracy. But even whether we choose socialism, that has to be a democratic choice. It can't be an imposition of activists, and it cannot be an imposition of intellectual elites saying that this is what the country now needs. It must be a democratic choice of all the people of our country to construct a better, equitable future for ourselves. And if that future is to be socialism, so be it. Thirdly, the point which I think we can take back from the past, and which Kumi alluded to, was that many of the leaders we find today in the ANC, in government, etc., were not tried and tested. And that is the hallmark of the 1980s. It gave us a period to have our leaders that we chose were tested by the popular struggles of that time. I think far too many of our leaders today get into position of leadership without ever having tested their leadership and without ever us being able to see whether there's that testing leadership. Vusi made the brilliant point about how so many of the 1980s people shaped or contributed towards a democratic state. And here I'm talking about the bureaucracy. And I think we need to take that struggle forward in respect of building a more capable and ethical state. Lastly, Chair, I must say I wrote a book, and I'm hoping that you're going to give me a punt on my book. If anyone has not read the book just yet, it is available. It's ANC Spy Bible. It is available in exclusives. Please grab it. And as a recognition of this Zoom thing, if you contact me, I would sign the copy for you. But please do read it. It is represents, as others say, some very interesting insights into that 1980 period as well. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Mo. Thank you. Thank you for keeping to time. Very precise, very concise. We're now about to conclude, but before we conclude, we've got 7 more minutes left. I'm going to give Comrade Mike Abrahams an opportunity. He's got only 2 minutes to commentator. Mike, you with us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Very brief. You got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I was a first-year student at the university in 1980. At the beginning of the boycott, there was a decision taken, learning from 76, that we have to go to the community. So we grouped ourselves into the communities where we came from to go and work in the community instead of just protesting on campus. It is out of that civics and other things, youth movements, civics, advice officers, and so forth were born. And I was part of that process. But I wanted to make this following 2 points in relation to this. When people usually ask me to say something about 1980, this is what I say. We were very young. We were scared, as Logan said. Our parents feared for our safety and our futures. We had to fight against our own peers to convince them that the decision that we're doing is correct. We had to convince our parents that the decision that we're taking is correct. We had to fight against our own teachers who told us to boycott and to engage in these struggles will negatively affect our futures. Now, it is in this context that these very young people had to fight against themselves, against their peers, against the parents, and then against the state. Now, if we look at it in that context, then we can say what we've seen achieved by this generation was enormous. I mean,
Thank you, Mike. We're running out of time.
No, I've got a short 1 point to make. A lot has been said here, but more has not been said. And until we write our own histories,
I agree with you
out of history.
We've got a good story to tell. And Mike, thank you for your contribution. We've got 2 more very short comments from Shedrick Boy and Good News Cardigan. So if you can keep it to 2 minutes each, I would be very grateful to both of you.
Hello.
To Shadrick, you with us?
Just here today.
Hello, Shadrick Boy, you with us?
Yes. what is crucial here is what I always tell people, that the 1980-79, we've laid the seeds of non-racialism. We continue to build into a front in the front politics up until we got the United Democratic Front. The fact that says FW declared and banned us is bull. We know for a matter of fact that we're the first ones who have laid the seeds of democracy. What we reap today in the broader society of a democratic society and a democratic organization were laid by the efforts of the 1980 boycott and the effort throughout the 80s. The way we united is the way we seated here today, in the way we've exchanged views critically and uncritically. But at the end of the day, we've laid the basis for a better society. This is what we are, and this is what we have done during 1980 and during the 1980 school boycott.
Thank you, Shadrach. We're going to leave it there. Let's ask Good News Cardigan to be our last speaker for a minute, and we will close. Good News.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you to the chair. I would like to just speak on one issue. What seems to me to be the death of the activist. To me, it seems like we buried the activists there and there in 1980. And I wonder, where are the graves? These special graves where people lie and sit in quiet and not respond to the challenges of today. Because that activism that was there would not have allowed some of what has developed into our nation today. I also wonder about how we show up in life today as professionals, as parents, and as ordinary leaders. It seems like there is a kind of a worldview that is missing, that is not congruent with the activism of 1980. And lastly, I want to sort of go into the future and go to 2060, 40 years from now, when a group of young leaders sits in a similar kind of fashion and reflect on 2020 as the year on which there have been a lot of challenges, COVID-19, the economy, leadership in general, and family, and say, how can we then influence that sitting of 2060 today, such that there is a different story to tell in 2060 than we are telling now of 1980? Oh, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Good News. Thank you so much. It's 4:59. I want to take this opportunity of placing on record my unequivocal thanks on behalf of the 1860 Heritage Center, to the panelists, to the commentators, for a wonderful program. All of us have been so enriched by the contributions from all the speakers. To conclude, I now give Selvin Naidoo an opportunity on behalf of the 1860 Center to say the concluding remarks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to all the participants for giving off your time. Advocate Pikoli, if you could just show your Liverpool badge, or you show your Liverpool scarf. I know you had it on earlier on.
Of course.
Yeah, so well done. Here we go. So well done. Well done for wearing that scarf. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Certainly, it's been a phenomenal talk. Lots of information shared. It certainly seems as though we could do more sessions. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, all the buddies. It's been a phenomenal session.
Thank you.
Ons klop almal.
Thank you for that. We'll end it.
Thank you.